It was 6:30 in the morning, August 27th in Adosaba. The conference hall was buzzing, hundreds of international journalists setting up their cameras, dozens of world leaders flipping through their notes when suddenly the atmosphere froze. Burkina Faso's interim president, Ibrahim Traoré, walked to the podium not with polite diplomacy in his hands, but with fire in his voice. And what he said in those next seconds would shake the world. Looking straight into the camera, he declared to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, "Mr. Netanyahu, you have 48 hours to apologize to Africa or you will no longer be welcome here. No metaphors, no diplomatic sugarcoating, just unshakable resolve." The hall fell silent. The words were like a thunderclap. Within minutes, clips of that ultimatum began racing across social media from Johannesburg to Washington, from Accra to New York. For many, it wasn't simply a clash between two leaders. It was the rebirth of African dignity, a refusal to bow, a declaration that sovereignty is not a gift from others, but a right that must be defended. And here lies the question for all of us: was this just a bold statement of one man or the beginning of a new order in African diplomacy? Can a small nation like Burkina Faso truly force the world to listen, or will the global powers crush this defiance as they have done for centuries? Stay with me until the very end, because what happened in Adosaba is more than politics. It is about dignity, unity, and the courage to speak truth to power. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to stand with President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that Africa's truth matters more than the headlines. The ultimatum did not fall from the sky. It was born out of a leak that revealed the hidden contempt of a powerful leader, and it ignited a fire across Africa. According to multiple diplomatic sources during a closed-door G7 meeting earlier in August, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu allegedly spoke words that African leaders could not ignore. Behind the polished speeches and the smiles for the cameras, he dismissed Africa's criticisms of Israel's Gaza campaign as naive, opportunistic, and militantly theatrical. Worse still, he was reported to have referred to Burkina Faso's interim president Ibrahim Traoré, directly mocking him as a mere political opportunist who used drama to cover for a weak state. These were not slips of the tongue. Journalists who later confirmed the leak noted that the language was crude, sharp, and deliberately demeaning. But Netanyahu's alleged remarks went further than insults. Sources claimed he hinted at supporting the International Monetary Fund in tightening debt recovery programs across Africa, programs that many Africans already viewed as economic chains. He was also said to have floated the idea of a new Western-sponsored alliance under the so-called Great Reconstruction 2030 Pact. To African ears, this was nothing short of an attempt to redraw the global map without them sidelining their interests under the cover of reconstruction. When the story broke, it spread like wildfire. On African radio, newspapers, and television, outrage poured in. Headlines screamed betrayal. Commentators spoke of humiliation. And then came the digital tidal wave. Within hours, the hashtag #AfricaIsNotYourPorn was trending across X, TikTok, and Facebook. Millions of young Africans reposted it, using their phones as weapons of dignity. It wasn't just about Netanyahu anymore. It was about a continent that had grown tired of being insulted, of being lectured to, of being treated as children in global politics. Yet, while public anger boiled over, Traoré himself remained silent. For days, he avoided comment, giving no interviews, offering no statements. Many mistook it for hesitation, but in hindsight, that silence was deliberate. He was waiting for the perfect stage, a stage where Africa, not foreign capitals, would control the narrative. That stage was the African Development Summit in Adosaba. On the morning of August 27th, Traoré stepped to the podium with the world watching. Journalists prepared for another routine speech about infrastructure, aid, and security. Instead, they witnessed history. Traoré looked directly into the cameras, his voice steady, his face unflinching, and said, "Mr. Netanyahu, Africa will not be your porn, nor the subject of debt chains or Western-sponsored experiments. You have 48 hours to apologize, or you will no longer be welcome on this continent. Not in trade, not in diplomacy, not in the future of history." For a moment, the air froze. Reporters stopped typing. Delegates glanced nervously at one another. The words echoed like a strike of thunder. It was not a threat of war, it was something deeper. It was a challenge to decades of imbalance, a demand for dignity. Within minutes, the clips began to circulate worldwide. African media carried it as breaking news. Global outlets replayed the ultimatum in astonishment. Social networks exploded, amplifying the scene to millions within hours. In Burkina Faso, people gathered in markets and village squares replaying the words on radios and phones. In South Africa, a foreign minister shared the video with the caption, "Finally someone said it." In Kenya, a former ambassador to the UN tweeted, "This is the future of African diplomacy, fearless and incorruptible." What began as a diplomatic dispute instantly transformed into a rallying cry for sovereignty. For many Africans, the moment was not about geopolitics, it was about respect. It was about refusing to be belittled. Ibrahim Traoré had spoken what countless citizens had long whispered: Africa's dignity is non-negotiable. And in that declaration, Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation battered by conflict, suddenly stood at the epicenter of a global storm. The Adosaba summit was meant to showcase development projects and trade commitments. Instead, it became the stage for a diplomatic earthquake. The moment Traoré's ultimatum rang out, the atmosphere changed. Delegates froze in their seats. Some gasped audibly. Others looked to their aides as if to ask, did he really just say that? Even seasoned journalists admitted later that they had never witnessed an African leader speak with such raw directness in front of the global press. Inside the conference hall, silence gave way to murmurs. The Israeli delegation shifted uncomfortably while several African officials exchanged discreet nods of approval. For decades, African diplomacy had been couched in careful language designed not to offend powerful partners. But Traoré had thrown aside that script. His words were not wrapped in politeness, they were a strike of dignity. And outside the hall, the reaction was immediate. Within minutes, global networks cut into regular programming to broadcast the ultimatum. Social media lit up like wildfire. The hashtag #AfricaIsNotYourPorn surged again, climbing into global trending charts within hours. Clips of the speech circulated not only across Africa, but throughout diaspora communities in Europe, the Caribbean, and North America. By midday, commentators were calling it one of the boldest statements ever made by an African leader on the international stage. In Burkina Faso, the effect was electric. Crowds gathered spontaneously in Ouagadougou's Independence Square, waving national flags and chanting Traoré's name. Homemade banners appeared with slogans like "Respect Africa" and "Long live Captain Traoré." Radios in rural villages replayed his words repeatedly, and families sat around fires discussing what it meant. Even in displacement camps where more than 2 million Burkinabé have fled jihadist violence, the ultimatum became a source of pride and unity. Across the continent, support poured in. South Africa's foreign minister shared the clip with the words, "Finally someone said it." In Nairobi, university students marched through campus holding up signs declaring African dignity is non-negotiable. In Accra, Ghanaian commentators praised Traoré for standing up against what they saw as decades of condescension from powerful states. And in Lagos, Nigeria, student unions issued a joint declaration urging the African Union to adopt a stronger collective stance against any nation that disrespects Africa. The African Union itself, often criticized for moving slowly, sprang into urgent discussions. Diplomats revealed that several member states were preparing a joint response if Netanyahu failed to apologize. For the first time in years, Africa's regional bodies seemed united, not by an external agenda, but by a shared defense of dignity. Israel's response, however, only fueled the storm. Netanyahu's office released a short, vague statement denying the leaked remarks, but avoided directly addressing Traoré's ultimatum. To many Africans, this sounded like dismissal, reinforcing the very grievance at the heart of the dispute that Africa's concerns are brushed aside rather than taken seriously. Analysts across African media interpreted the silence as confirmation of disrespect. Meanwhile, reactions rippled across the globe. In Europe, leaders avoided direct condemnation but expressed concern over the tone. In Moscow and Beijing, state media amplified Traoré's words as evidence of a global South rising against Western dominance. In Washington, the debate was intense. Some political analysts labeled Traoré reckless, warning that his defiance could fracture fragile alliances. But others, especially among African American scholars and activists, saw it as historic courage. They argued that for once, an African head of state was not begging for aid or recognition, but demanding equality on the global stage. By the evening of the first day, the ultimatum had spilled far beyond diplomacy. In London, Paris, and New York, African diaspora groups rallied in public squares. In Harlem, marchers carried both U.S. and Burkina Faso flags, chanting "Africa stands tall, Africa stands proud." Portraits of Thomas Sankara were raised high, linking Traoré's boldness to a lineage of uncompromising African leadership. The momentum was undeniable. What began as one man's declaration had grown into a rallying cry repeated from village radios to university auditoriums, from dusty markets to diaspora capitals. The ultimatum was no longer just a 48-hour challenge. It had become a mirror reflecting Africa's long struggle for respect. For millions, the defiance symbolized more than politics. It symbolized hope, unity, and the belief that Africa could finally speak with one voice. The ultimatum did not remain an isolated headline. It carried immediate ripple effects inside Burkina Faso and across Africa's political landscape, touching civil society governance and the balance of power between citizens and their leaders. In Ouagadougou, the impact was instant. Public squares filled with thousands of supporters waving Burkina Faso's flag and chanting, "Respect Africa, respect Traore." Neighborhood committees organized impromptu marches. Student groups painted slogans on walls. Africa is not for sale. Dignity is non-negotiable. For a country scarred by years of jihadist attacks and political instability, the ultimatum provided a rare sense of unity. Even communities divided by religion or ethnicity found common ground in the president's words. Among displaced families living in makeshift camps, the ultimatum spread through radios and conversations around cooking fires. People who had lost homes and livelihoods said they felt for once that their suffering was linked to a larger struggle, that the disrespect Africa endured on the global stage was connected to their own hardships. In insurgency-hit villages, local leaders reported a new sense of pride, as if Traore's voice had given their struggles international visibility. Politically, the ultimatum reshaped domestic dynamics. Opposition figures, once vocal critics of Traore's military-led rule, suddenly hesitated. To attack him at such a moment risked appearing unpatriotic. Several opposition leaders even issued cautious statements of support, framing the ultimatum as a matter of national honor rather than party politics. Approval ratings for Traore surged sharply. A recent Afrobarometer poll suggested that 66% of Burkina citizens now accepted military rule, a dramatic increase compared to just 24% in 2012. The ultimatum reinforced this trend, consolidating his legitimacy not only as a transitional leader but as a defender of national dignity. Across Africa, civic organizations seized the moment. Student unions from Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal issued joint declarations calling on the African Union to stand behind Burkina Faso. Faith leaders, both Muslim and Christian, spoke from pulpits about the importance of protecting Africa's dignity. Civil society groups organized teach-ins and debates, reframing the ultimatum as a symbol of collective resistance against external control. For many ordinary Africans, it was the first time they felt truly represented on the world stage. The African Union itself, often accused of being slow to act, responded with unusual urgency. Insiders reported that several states began drafting a coordinated stance, considering measures ranging from diplomatic protests to a review of trade agreements with Israel. For once, the AU was not merely reacting to crises imposed from outside, but asserting its own agenda in defense of African sovereignty. Yet the momentum also carried risks. International financial institutions quietly warned that Burkina Faso's confrontational stance could scare off investors or invite economic sanctions. Western diplomats sought private meetings with Traore's advisors, probing whether the ultimatum was symbolic or the beginning of a harder policy shift. Analysts cautioned that if the 48-hour deadline passed without tangible results, disappointment could set in, weakening the unity the ultimatum had inspired. Still, for the time being, the energy was undeniable. Inside Burkina Faso, the ultimatum had transformed a nation battered by violence into one united by pride. Across Africa, it reignited debates about sovereignty, respect, and the continent's rightful place in global politics. For ordinary citizens, the ultimatum was not just about Netanyahu or Israel, it was about reclaiming dignity after generations of being sidelined. The civil and political consequences were profound: a surge of public unity, a strengthening of Traore's political hand, and a rare moment of continental solidarity. Whether temporary or lasting, the ultimatum had already shifted the ground beneath African politics. As the 48-hour clock began to tick, the ultimatum reverberated far beyond Africa's borders. In Washington, the reaction was split. Established policymakers dismissed Traore's words as reckless, a risky gamble that could fracture fragile alliances in the Sahel and complicate America's counterterrorism strategies. Think tanks framed it as the bold posturing of a young leader trying to carve out influence on the world stage. But beyond the corridors of government, the tone was very different. Among African-American scholars, activists, and community leaders, Traoré's defiance was celebrated as a breakthrough. At Howard University, students gathered in forums to dissect the ultimatum, many describing it as the first time they had heard an African president speak with such clarity in real time. In Los Angeles, UCLA classrooms turned into heated debates on the meaning of sovereignty, respect, and leadership. Commentators on Black-owned media outlets praised the ultimatum as unfiltered courage and compared Traoré to earlier voices of resistance from Kwame Nkrumah to Malcolm X. In New York City, the diaspora made their stance visible. Thousands converged in Harlem waving both U.S. and Burkina Faso flags. Portraits of Thomas Sankara appeared alongside signs quoting Traoré's ultimatum verbatim. Chants filled the streets. Africa stands tall. Africa stands proud. For many, it was not only about defending Burkina Faso, it was about reclaiming a shared history of dignity. Europe, meanwhile, walked a tightrope. Leaders in Paris, Berlin, and Brussels issued cautious statements urging constructive dialogue, but avoided condemning either side. Yet behind the diplomatic language lay unease. Analysts admitted privately that Europe's traditional influence in Africa was slipping. The spectacle of a small West African nation openly defying a global power forced uncomfortable questions. Could Europe still dictate terms in Africa, or was the balance of influence tilting irreversibly? In Moscow and Beijing, the response was swift and opportunistic. Russian and Chinese state media hailed Traoré as a symbol of the global South's awakening. Commentators portrayed the ultimatum as proof that the post-colonial order was collapsing, replaced by a new multipolar reality. For these powers, Traoré's stance offered an opening to deepen partnerships across Africa, framing themselves as allies in a shared struggle against Western dominance. In the Middle East, the reaction was more complex. Some governments condemned the ultimatum as a reckless provocation that could escalate tensions. Others, however, privately admired the boldness. Analysts in Cairo and Amman suggested that a small African state forcing a powerful Israeli leader onto the defensive was an extraordinary inversion of the usual order. Even if unspoken, there was respect for the audacity. The global media landscape reflected the shockwaves. Western outlets like CNN and BBC debated whether Traoré was undermining diplomacy or ushering in a new era of African assertiveness. Al Jazeera covered the story extensively, highlighting African voices that framed the ultimatum as long overdue. In contrast, Israeli outlets criticized it as populism designed to distract from Burkina Faso's internal challenges. By the end of the 48 hours, one truth was undeniable: the ultimatum had shifted the global conversation. For Washington, it was a reminder that Africa could no longer be taken for granted. For Europe, it was a warning of diminishing leverage. For Russia and China, it was an opportunity. And for the millions in the diaspora, it was inspiration, a sign that Africa's voice could cut through the noise of world politics with clarity and force. When the final hours of the ultimatum passed without an apology from Prime Minister Netanyahu, many expected disappointment. Yet what followed was something deeper, something lasting. The ultimatum had already achieved what no statement of apology could. It forced the world to listen. For once, Africa was not begging for respect, it was demanding it. Inside Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré's words became more than politics. They became a story repeated in homes markets and refugee camps. Families told their children our president stood tall before the world. For a continent long defined by outside powers, that image carried enormous weight. Across Africa, leaders who once dismissed Traoré as too radical now cited him with respect. Even in capitals tied closely to Israel, the conversation shifted. What counted as acceptable diplomacy with Africa had been redrawn. But the ultimatum also carries a warning. The power of such bold defiance can fade if not matched with real progress on security, on governance, on prosperity. In Burkina Faso, more than 7,000 people have died in conflict over the past year alone. Human rights groups have raised alarms about conscription and dissent. If these issues remain unresolved, the same people who now cheer Traoré could turn in frustration. Symbolism must be followed by substance. Globally, the ultimatum reminds us of an old truth: dignity cannot be gifted, it must be claimed. Africa's future will not be decided in Washington, Paris, or Tel Aviv. It will be decided in Ouagadougou, in Lagos, in Nairobi, in the voices of ordinary Africans refusing to bow. That message reverberates not only in African capitals, but also in Harlem, Kingston, and London, wherever the diaspora gathers, to say Africa stands tall. And so I ask you, do you believe this moment marks the beginning of a new African diplomacy, one that refuses to be silenced? Or will the weight of global powers crush this spirit before it can fully take root? Can we continue to trust that President Ibrahim Traoré's strategies for sovereignty are truly effective? Or should another path be prepared for Africa's future? Please share this video if you believe you are among the first to stand with President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth of Africa's dignity matters more than the headlines. Because in the end, this is bigger than one ultimatum. It is about Africa rising not as a guest at someone else's table, but as a builder of its own.